So, one of the hardest things for people to understand in Codename 1 is why the layout behaves the way that it does and how to work with that. So the default layout in Codename 1 is to just place components in a flow layout, which seems to make sense until you actually try doing something complex with it or try to nest something elaborate like a list into a flow layout. Now, a flow layout places things in their natural size. Natural size, we call it preferred size in Codename 1, which essentially means every component has a size that it requests from the system. So, for instance, you'll notice the button here, if we give it really long, it will grow. That's its preferred size growing based on its content. So, the same is true for every component in Codename 1. And when we work with layouts, we need to understand they arrange elements and they take the preferred size into consideration to some degree. They don't necessarily respect it always, but they use it. So that's generally the flow layout. It places things in a flow. And you can't place things absolutely. You can't tell something to be in place X, Y. And the reason for that is that the system might rotate. Different device, its font size might be different. For instance, iPhone 4 has exactly double the pixels of iPhone 3. So you would want the font to be larger. And if they're larger, the components need to be positioned in a different location, and that's what the layout manager does. So this is the basic flow layout that we have right here. As you can see, it just arranges things in a flow sort of way. Now, we can align things, for instance, like that. And we can also do things. We can also align not just to the center or to the right, as we'll see. We can also align to the bottom, for instance. So we can get something like that. It's still not necessarily what we want though, because flow layout is really good for simple stuff, for just placing things like labels, buttons, and stuff like that. And the reason for that is that it's smart. When we start adding lots of components, it starts breaking lines, which works great for a component like a button, where we always know the size of the button. But if we take a component like a text area, which might break its lines depending on how much space it has available, then this will suddenly not work because the flow layout doesn't know how much space it has available yet, because it needs to arrange everything, and only then it will find out. So the flow layout is really bad at working with components that change their sizes in runtime. And these are all the components that are complex, like text area, like list. You can place them in a flow layout, but you need to determine their size in advance and tell them not to grow. And that's not always what you would want to do. So we have better layouts, like the box layout Y. I'll start with that first. It's great. It's good if that's the sort of UI you want. It might be good for the multi-button sort of UI. You often want to arrange things like this. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you want things to be more elaborate. So for that, we nest layouts. So I can just take a container and place it right here. And as you can see, the container is really small right now. But I can add, well, multi-button might not be the one thing I want to put here, but I might want to put a button and another button and maybe a label. And this works really well. Now you'll notice this container is a flow layout container, so it will break lines within the box layout and do all sorts of things, which might not be what we want. So I can go to the nested container and say, I want this to use the box layout X. Now the box layout X might seem like a type of flow layout at first glance, and it really is in some regards. It just doesn't have the same sort of limitations that the flow layout has, because it doesn't break lines. So this limitation actually solves a lot of the problems that are inherent in the flow layout. It can grow, it can align properly. You'll notice the labels are properly aligned because they take up the entire space exactly. So as you can see, the box layout X and box layout Y have one thing really important in common. They take the preferred size into consideration only on one axis, which is the opposite from the one they're at. So you'll notice the button here has its preferred size in the terms of the height, but it's stretched on the y-axis. This is on the x-axis. Now this is obviously a y layout. On the box axis, you'll notice the label is stretched in comparison to the buttons, but their width is exactly their preferred width. So this is really useful exactly for this case, where things can be aligned perfectly when they're in the x-axis, and also be properly occupy the screen where they're in the y-axis. So nesting these is really, really useful for lots of user interfaces. Now, the grid layout is a bit more elaborate there. So a one-column grid isn't necessarily very useful, but if we add more columns, you will see the sort of thing. I'll remove this container because it's not exactly useful here. But you can essentially arrange everything in a grid, and you'll notice that it takes up the preferred size of the largest component. So this is really not necessarily useful for every use case, but it's really good if you have a set of icons that you want to arrange in a grid. Then the grid layout is really, really useful. And in that particular case, and we use that a lot, we use that in the kitchen sink demo, for instance, when we want to switch to a grid view. The table layout has its own advantages. So for instance, I can have a 4-column table layout, but I'll need a bit more rows for that. Let's give it something like that. And as you can see, it sort of occupies the right amount of space here. Now, a table layout and a border layout, which we'll get to soon enough, are constrained layouts, which means that every entry within the layout has a constraint to it. And a constraint allows us to define all sorts of properties about this component. So, for instance, I want this label to occupy 2 columns, so I can define horizontal span as 2. And as you can see, the label takes up more space. The same is true for lots of elements we can define here, including alignments or all sorts of things like that. And it's an interesting set of abilities for a table. It's a really complex layout, so I suggest using it only if you really know what you are doing. So for the last layout, probably one of the hardest ones to grasp, because it's so different from if you're not from a background of Swing or AWT, we have the border layout. And yes, there is layered layout, but that's a completely different subject. I won't go into it. Now, a border layout has 5 sides: north, south, west, and east. I always get them confused, and the center. Now, there's a trick here where the border layout also allows you to get an absolute center, which works sort of like this, where the center doesn't stretch. It's really centered. So the border layout, I undooed here, so the border layout is really, really useful when you want to put one thing next to another or one thing on top of another in various ways. So I say, for instance, I have, with a button this isn't as useful, but with say a list, say I have a list of items, and say I want to have a button right here on top saying delete an item from the list. So I can just place the list, or better yet, I'll place a container at the north portion, and like I said, this is a constrained layout, so I can just do it from here, and then just place all sorts of buttons to do all sorts of things to this list. So for instance, I've got this list here, and I can place things like to delete an entry in the list, add an entry to the list, and all sorts of other operations. In fact, the title area is really placed in the north portion of the form. So we internally use it for all sorts of things like that. It's one of the most useful layouts we have. And explaining this, often people are struck by, okay, this is limiting in terms of what I can and can't do. But you need to understand that you can nest layouts as much as you want. And that is the true power of the layout managers. Because when you nest them, you can essentially create almost any user interface you have on your mind and build any sort of UI you would like to. So thanks for watching, and please talk with us on the forum about Codename 1. Thanks.